Parshas Achrimos. This week's Parsha begins with a commandment by God. He says it to Moshe, intended for Moshe's brother, Aharon, who was the high priest, the Kohen Hagadol, that he may not enter the Holy of Holies on a whim or anytime he wants. And he can't enter in his normal clothing, not even in the normal clothing of the Kohen Hagadol, which is called the Big Day Zahav. They had a lot of gold on them. But rather, he can only come in the midst of doing the Yom Kippur service, and he may only come in the Big Day Lavan in the white clothes, and that is all the linen. The Torah says, Ksonis Bat Kodesh, this is now in Tes Zayin Daled, Ksonis Bat Kodesh Yilbash, U'michnasei Bad Yu Abasoro, V'avneit Bad Yachkor, Mitzefes Bad Yitznof Big Day Kodeshem. So this is talking about all the linen clothing, sacred linen tunic, that's white, linen breeches, those are pants, also white, shall be on his flesh, gird himself with a linen sash, and cover his head with a linen turban. So the clothing of the Kohen Hagadol when he goes inside the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur has to be very plain, has to be very specifically linen, white linen clothing. Okay, and then the Torah goes on and it talks about the service in the Beis HaMikdash by the Kohen Hagadol, the Avodah, on Yom Kippur. And there's Vidui, there's the Seir Lashem and Seir Lazazel. They're the two goats, one of which is brought in on the altar in the Beis HaMikdash, the other is thrown off a cliff, the original scapegoat. And then there's the Ketores, and other aspects of the service of the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. And then the Torah ends this passage with repeating the command of Yom Kippur, and then saying at the end, this will be for you an eternal decree. This is talking about Yom Kippur, that to achieve atonement for the children of Israel once a year. And Aaron did what as God had commanded Moshe. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that he didn't enter regularly? Now, when was this command given? Well, this command was given, says Rashi, in Nisan. This is Rashi on Lamed Daled. Actually, it's the Meforshei Rashi who say that this was given in Nisan. So you have Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz of Elul, Tishrei. 7 months until Yom Kippur. So when exactly did he do this? So Rashi says as follows. Kishehigia, in fact, Rashi says this is commenting about the period that happened after the day that happened, the Yom Kippur day, which happened 7 months later after the command was given. Kishehigia Yom Kippurim asa kaseder hazeh. When Yom Kippur came, Aaron did what he was told. Okay. Ulagid shvacho shel Aharon shelo haya lovshan l'gdula, so that he didn't wear them implicitly is the big day lavan, the special white clothing for the service. Didn't wear it for his own greatness, to make himself great, ela k'mekayim gezeras hamelech, but rather as though he were, or in the manner of somebody who's fulfilling the mandate of the king. This is based on a Toras Kohanim, and the Chafetz Chayim in his commentary on the Toras Kohanim says if Aharon had a choice, he wouldn't have worn those clothes. So, in other words, he wore it only because he was commanded, but not to aggrandize himself. Now, Schwab asks a question. He says, I could understand wearing fancy clothing and being tempted or having mixed motivations, ulterior motives, to perform the service, because you get to wear the equivalent of, the priestly equivalent of the royal robes. It's the priestly robes that were made of gold. He said, but what's the logic here? What's Rashi saying when he says that Aharon is not wearing these clothes for aggrandizement, for self-aggrandizement, but rather as one who's fulfilling the command of the king? What kind of aggrandizement is there in wearing simple white linen robes? It's a curious observation. And Rav Schwab says that a person can, in fact, wear fancy clothes to aggrandize himself, but a person can also appear pious in order to aggrandize himself. In other words, the plain clothing, which could be viewed as a reflection of the utter humility that one must have when he goes lifnai ulifnim, when a person goes into the Holy of Holies and gets as close as is humanly possible in a figurative sense to the divine presence. Person can aggrandize himself by his unassuming clothing, his uniform. In other words, look at me, I'm special. And Rav Schwab uses a play on words. We say about the Almighty, b'makom she'atamotze gadluso, atamotze amvesanuso. Where you find God's greatness, you also find his humility. And Rav Schwab says, what Rashi is saying here is that where you find his humility, you're not finding his aggrandizement. This notion of appearing publicly pious it has a term. In Rashi doesn't use it, but it has a term in the Gemara. It's called mechsi kiyuhara. It appears as though somebody is doing something arrogant. It's a concern, the Avudraham, when he talks about the mitzvah of Kriyas Shema. And the question is, a person, a chassan, a groom on the first night of his marriage, so he's exempt from reading Kriyas Shema. Is he allowed to read Kriyas Shema, even though he's exempt? It's a matter of some question. Nowadays, it's not, because we're presumed not to have the same level of focus and intentionality as they did in the times of the Gemara. But there are certain actions that a person can take which are in their nature pious actions, but they end up creating an appearance of self-promotion. Mechsi kiyuhara. A person looks like he's pumping himself up. The Avudraham defines this. He says, Shekol davar she'eino adam mechuyev bo. Every matter on which an individual is not obligated, va'oso sabarabim b'midas chasidus, and he does it in publicly, open, notorious, as a pious act, v'chol ha'am enam osim oso, and the rest of the people don't do it, then mischazi kiyura, he appears as though he is haughty. There are many applications of this halacha. Doing something unusual in our communities, as opposed to some Hasidic communities, it is not customary to wear a beged of tzitzis over one's clothing. And the Mari Bruno, who's a Rishon, I first heard this from my Rabbi Rabbi Soloveitchik in connection with a question about whether a person should wear his tzitzis out or in. And he says, Mari Bruno says that if somebody wears his tzitzis, his talis katan, over his clothing, said it's obvious, it's manifest. So then mechsi kiyuhara, he's not obligated, and if he does it, although it might be deemed to be a righteous act, he runs the risk of appearing arrogant. Somebody who flails about in his davening with excessive hand motions and clapping when other people don't do it. Sometimes you're in a minyan where everybody's acting out like that, in which case presumably it's okay, at least according to the standard of the Avudraham. But if somebody is in a less demonstrative community and they do very big, deep dives when they're bowing, could be a problem of mechsi kiyuhara. The general principle is, if I'm demonstrating my piety in a public venue, and I'm doing something that has the appearance of piety beyond the standard, I run a risk. My father, Zichrono Livracha, was very sensitive to not adopting practices that would be manifestly acts of piety. I was recalling to one of my children who was asking me about when do I wear my talis over head? When did my father wear his talis over his head? And I pointed out to him that my father was the Rav of a shul of Young Israel in Detroit for about 35 years. And I recall specifically, he sat next to the president, sat on the bima, as in many shuls, that's the standard practice for the rabbi. He did it only during the day. And the president sat next to him. When he sat next to a president who did not put his talis over his head, my father did not put his talis over his head. And then a president came to the position, and he wore his talis overhead. Next thing you knew, my father was wearing his talis over his head. And it became apparent, I never asked my father about it, but it became apparent that he was not going to do something that looked unusually pious. And what Rashi is saying here about Aharon Kohen, about Aaron the high priest, is that he could have had this self-concept of being holier than everyone else, and look at me, I'm wearing the special garments of the high priest. But rather, instead, the Torah simply says he followed directions. The things that he did, whether in private or in public, were only because God commanded, and not because of the effect it would have on people's assessment of his own spiritual nature and his own greatness. Have a good chance.